He thought humiliating her would entertain the room, but he had no idea he was about to witness something that would haunt his reputation forever. The grand recital hall of Westbridge Conservatory glowed under warm golden chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished mahogany floors and a Steinway grand piano placed dead center like a throne awaiting its rightful owner. Yet tonight, that throne was about to become a stage for mockery, or so Maestro Leonard Graves believed, standing tall in his tailored black suit, silver hair perfectly combed, his presence commanding silence from the audience of donors, students, and elite faculty, members who filled every velvet seat with quiet anticipation, their murmurs fading into a respectful hush as he adjusted his cufflinks and scanned the room with the confidence of a man who had built his career on precision, discipline, and an unshakable belief that talent could be measured at a glance. And then his eyes landed on her, Eleanor Hayes, standing near the side wall beside a card of sheet music, her simple beige cardigan slightly wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a modest clip, her posture careful, almost invisible, as if she had mastered the art of existing without being noticed, a woman many in the room had seen countless times, yet never truly looked at, dismissed as nothing more than the conservatory's quiet maintenance worker, whispered about as someone's wife, someone who didn't belong in a place where brilliance was expected to shine loudly and without apology. And yet tonight, fate, or perhaps something far more deliberate, was about to place her directly beneath the brightest spotlight in the building, because just moments earlier, the evening's featured pianist had withdrawn unexpectedly, a sudden illness leaving the program in jeopardy and the audience restless. And instead of canceling, Graves had smiled, a thin, calculated smile that hinted at something less than generosity, his gaze drifting once more toward Eleanor as an idea took shape, not out of necessity, but out of amusement, a quiet cruelty wrapped in sophistication. And as he stepped forward to the microphone, his voice smooth and deliberate, he addressed the room with a tone that carried both authority and a trace of something sharper, something almost playful, announcing that in the spirit of adaptability and artistic exploration, they would invite an unexpected participant to the stage, someone who had, in his words, spent enough time around greatness to perhaps absorb a fraction of it. And a ripple of polite laughter spread through the audience, uncertain at first, then growing as he turned fully toward Eleanor, extending a hand, as though offering an honor, though the glint in his eyes told a different story. And for a moment, she didn't move, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the card, her gaze steady but unreadable, the room now watching with a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment, whispers beginning to rise again like a low tide creeping across the hall, students exchanging glances, faculty members leaning toward one another, some amused, others skeptical, none expecting anything more than an awkward spectacle that would be quickly forgotten. And yet as Eleanor finally stepped forward, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, there was something in the way she carried herself, something subtle yet undeniable, as if beneath the simple fabric and quiet demeanor lay a story the room had never bothered to hear. And as she approached the piano, the massive instrument reflecting her image back at her in its glossy surface, the air shifted ever so slightly, a tension building not from anticipation of failure, but from something deeper, something unspoken. And though Maestro Graves believed he was orchestrating a harmless moment of entertainment, the truth lingered just beyond his awareness, waiting patiently, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is not silent out of weakness, but because they are waiting for the exact moment when silence becomes power. And when that moment arrives, it doesn't ask for attention, it takes it. The bench creaked softly beneath Eleanor Hayes as she took her seat at the grand piano, a sound so small it would have gone unnoticed on any other night. But here, in a room filled with expectation and quiet judgment, it seemed to echo louder than it should have, as though even the instrument itself was aware of the unusual presence now resting before it. And for a brief moment, nothing happened, no music, no movement, just a stillness that stretched uncomfortably across the hall, the kind of silence that made people shift in their seats and glance sideways at one another, unsure whether to feel amused or embarrassed. And Maestro Leonard Graves, standing just off to the side, folded his arms with a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, confident that the hesitation he was witnessing would soon validate his decision, because in his mind, this was already over, already proven, already a harmless display of what happened when someone stepped beyond their place. And yet Eleanor did not rush. She did not apologize. She did not even look at him. Instead, she adjusted the piano bench by less than an inch, a precise movement that seemed almost instinctive, then gently rested her hands in her lap, her fingers loosely interlaced, her breathing steady, controlled, as though she were not standing in front of hundreds of watchful eyes, but somewhere far removed from the weight of this moment. And in the audience, the whispers grew slightly louder, a few students leaning forward with curious expressions while others exchanged quiet laughs behind their programs. One voice barely above a murmur saying she probably cannot even read the sheet music. Another responding that this will be over in seconds. And near the front row, Isabel Crown, one of the conservatory's rising stars, tilted her head with a mixture of interest and skepticism, her polished appearance and poised posture a stark contrast to the woman now sitting at the piano. And yet even she could not look away, because something about Eleanor's stillness did not match the narrative being projected onto her. Something about the way she occupied the space felt deliberate rather than accidental. And then, slowly, Eleanor lifted her hands from her lap and placed them just above the keys, not touching them yet, hovering, as though reacquainting herself with a language she had not spoken aloud in years, her fingers slightly curved, perfectly aligned. A posture that any trained musician would recognize instantly, though most in the room were too distracted by their assumptions to notice. And Maestro Graves shifted his weight, his patience thinning just enough for a flicker of irritation to cross his face, because the longer this moment stretched, the less amusing it became, and he cleared his throat softly, a subtle reminder that the performance was expected to begin. But Eleanor did not react to the cue, not outwardly. Instead, her eyes lowered to the keys, her expression calm, almost distant, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. And in that quiet, something began to change, not in the room, not yet, but within her, a shift so subtle it would have been invisible to anyone not paying close attention, the kind of internal alignment that happens when memory and instinct find each other again after years apart. And somewhere in the back of her mind, images flickered, not fully formed, not intrusive, but present enough to steady her. A stage much larger than this one, lights far brighter, applause that carried through her chest like a heartbeat, and then the absence of it all, the quiet life she had chosen, or perhaps accepted, a life where her hands had learned to clean and organize instead of perform, where her name had faded into the background of other people's brilliance. And yet none of that seemed to matter now, because as her fingers finally descended to touch the keys, the contact was immediate and certain, no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a quiet recognition, like returning home after a long and silent journey. And although no sound had been made yet, the shift was undeniable, because in that single moment, before the first note even existed, Eleanor Hayes was no longer the invisible woman the room believed her to be, and for reasons none of them could yet explain, the laughter began to fade, replaced by something far more fragile, a growing awareness that whatever was about to happen next would not follow the script they had already written in their minds. And Maestro Graves, though he would never admit it, felt it too, a subtle tightening in his chest, a brief and unwelcome thought that perhaps, just perhaps, he had miscalculated. And then the room held its breath. The first note did not explode into the room. It arrived, soft and deliberate, like a single drop of rain before a storm. And yet it carried a clarity so precise that it sliced cleanly through every lingering whisper, every trace of doubt, every quiet laugh that had not yet fully faded. And in that instant, something shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably, as if the air itself had been recalibrated. And Eleanor Hayes did not look up. She did not acknowledge the room or the hundreds of eyes now fixed on her. Instead, she let the next note follow, then another, each one placed with an intention that could not be mistaken for luck or accident, her fingers moving with a controlled grace that belonged not to someone experimenting or guessing, but to someone who understood exactly where each sound needed to land and why. And within seconds, the melody began to take shape, complex, layered, demanding. the kind of peace that most performers approached with visible effort. Their bodies tensing, their expressions tightening as they navigated its technical demands. But Eleanor remained still, almost impossibly so, her shoulders relaxed, her posture steady, her hands doing the work with an efficiency that made it look effortless. And in the audience, the reaction was subtle at first, a few heads tilting slightly, a couple of students exchanging confused glances instead of amused ones, because what they were hearing did not align with what they had expected, not even close. And near the front row, Isabel Crown leaned forward without realizing it, her polished composure slipping just enough to reveal genuine curiosity, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to reconcile the sound with the person producing it, because this was not hesitation, this was not amateur exploration, this was precision, and more than that, it was interpretation, something far more difficult to fake, something that required not just skill, but understanding. And as the piece progressed, Eleanor's playing deepened, the dynamics shifting with a confidence that suggested complete ownership of the music, not just following the notes on the page, but reshaping them, breathing into them, allowing the melody to expand and contract in ways that felt both unexpected and completely right. And somewhere to the side of the stage, Maestro Leonard Graves felt his expression change before he could stop it, the faint smirk gone, replaced by a stillness that mirrored the room, his arms slowly lowering from their folded position as his attention sharpened, because this was no longer a curiosity. This was something else entirely, something that demanded recognition whether he was willing to give it or not. And he watched her hands now, really watched them, noticing details he had overlooked before, the economy of movement, the absence of wasted motion, the way her fingers curved and extended with perfect timing, the kind of technique that could not be taught in a few lessons or picked up by observation alone. It required years, decades even, of disciplined practice, and the realization began to form, slow and unwelcome, that the narrative he had constructed moments earlier was unraveling in real time, thread by thread, and in the back rows, the last traces of laughter disappeared completely, replaced by a silence that felt heavier, more attentive, as if the entire hall had collectively leaned in without moving. And then came a passage in the piece known among musicians for its difficulty, a rapid sequence that demanded both speed and control, the kind of section that separated the competent from the exceptional. And Eleanor did not hesitate, her hands accelerating seamlessly, each note landing with a clarity that seemed almost impossible at that tempo. The sound crisp, articulate, alive, and a quiet gasp escaped from somewhere in the audience before being swallowed by the growing stillness. Because now there was no confusion left, no misunderstanding, only recognition. And as the final notes of that passage settled into the air, resonating briefly before fading, the room did not react with applause or whispers. It simply held, suspended in a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as though no one wanted to break it, as though they understood, perhaps for the first time that evening, that they were no longer witnessing an interruption or a mistake, but something far rarer, something that could not be repeated on command, something that demanded to be experienced fully before it disappeared. And Eleanor, still seated at the piano, continued without pause, her expression unchanged, her focus absolute, as if none of this was surprising to her at all, as if this moment had always been waiting, not for the room, but for her. By the time Eleanor Hayes reached the middle of the piece, the music no longer belonged to the room. It commanded it, every phrase unfolding with a quiet authority that left no space for doubt or distraction, and the audience, once restless and quietly amused, now sat frozen in a collective stillness, as if any movement might shatter what was happening in front of them, because this was no longer just a performance. It was a revelation unfolding note by note, and Eleanor's hands moved across the keys with a fluid precision that blurred the line between technique and instinct, her fingers gliding, lifting, returning with exact timing, never rushed, never forced, each motion economical and deliberate, as though the instrument itself was responding to her rather than the other way around. And in the front row, Isabel Crown felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest, not jealousy, not admiration, but something closer to humility, a realization that what she was witnessing existed beyond the competitions and accolades she had built her identity around, and she lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back again, unable to pull herself away, while on the side of the stage, Maestro Leonard Graves stood completely still, his earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet tension that he could not mask, because with every passing measure, the gap between what he had expected and what was unfolding widened into something undeniable, something irreversible, and he replayed the moment. In his mind, when he had extended his hand toward Eleanor, the subtle amusement, the calculated dismissal, and for the first time in years, a single thought crossed his mind that he could not immediately silence, the possibility that he had underestimated not just a person, but a presence, and the music continued to build, the dynamics expanding, rising into a powerful crescendo that filled the hall with a resonance so full it seemed to press against the walls themselves. Yet Eleanor remained composed, her expression calm, her breathing steady, as if she were simply following a path she had walked many times before, and then, just as naturally, she pulled the sound back, guiding it into a softer passage, a delicate sequence that required not strength, but control, and her touch became lighter, almost weightless, the notes floating into the space with a clarity that made the silence between them just as important as the sound itself. And the contrast was striking, the ability to command both power and restraint with equal mastery. And somewhere in the back of the hall, a donor who had attended countless performances leaned slightly forward, his brows drawn together in quiet concentration, because even to an untrained ear, there was something unmistakably different about this interpretation, something that could not be replicated through practice alone, and the room remained silent, not out of obligation, but out of respect that had formed without permission, without announcement, simply as a response to what was being given to them. And as Eleanor approached the final movement of the piece, the energy shifted once more, not with urgency, but with purpose, each phrase leading seamlessly into the next, building toward a conclusion that felt both inevitable and entirely in her control. And Maestro Graves, still watching, felt his throat tighten slightly, a sensation he was not accustomed to, because this was no longer about the music alone. It was about the undeniable collapse of a narrative he had so confidently constructed, and he realized, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that this moment would not end the way he had intended, that whatever followed would not be easily dismissed or explained away. And as Eleanor's hands moved into the final passage, her fingers tracing the last sequence with unwavering precision, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath once more, suspended between expectation and realization, because now there was no question left, no uncertainty, only the quiet understanding that what they were witnessing would not be forgotten, not by the students, not by the audience, and certainly not by the man who had invited her to the stage for all the wrong reasons. And when the final note approached, it did not feel like an ending, but like a truth arriving exactly when it was meant to, undeniable, complete, and impossible to ignore. The final note did not crash into silence, it settled into it, lingering just long enough to leave an imprint before fading completely. And for a moment that stretched beyond time itself, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe, as if the entire conservatory had collectively forgotten how, the air thick with something deeper than admiration, something closer to realization. And Eleanor Hayes kept her hands resting lightly on the keys for a fraction longer, her posture unchanged, her gaze still lowered, as though she understood the weight of that silence better than anyone else in the room. And when she finally lifted her fingers, the absence of sound felt just as powerful as the music that had come before it. And then, slowly, almost reluctantly, she rose from the bench, her movements calm, unhurried, not seeking acknowledgement, not waiting for approval, simply completing what she had come to do. And still, the room remained frozen, the kind of silence that does not come from uncertainty, but from the inability to immediately process what has just happened. And in the front row, Isabel Crown was the first to react, though even she did not clap at first, her hands hovering slightly, as if unsure whether applause would somehow diminish the moment, her eyes fixed on Eleanor with a new understanding that had not been there before. And then, somewhere near the center of the hall, a single pair of hands came together, the sound sharp against the stillness, followed by another, and another, until the entire room erupted into applause so sudden and overwhelming that it seemed to echo off the high ceilings and marble walls, a standing ovation rising almost instinctively, not out of obligation, but out of something far more genuine, something earned in a way that could not be debated or dismissed. And Eleanor paused briefly, turning just enough to acknowledge the audience with a small, composed nod, her expression still quiet, still grounded, as though the reaction, while appreciated, was not the reason she had played. And on the side of the stage, Maestro Leonard Graves stood motionless, the applause washing over him without effect, his hands at his sides, his posture rigid, because while the room celebrated, he was left with something far more difficult to confront, the undeniable collapse of his own assumptions. And he watched as Eleanor stepped away from the piano, not toward the spotlight, not toward the center of the stage, but back toward the edge, toward the place she had come from, her steps steady, her presence no longer invisible. And for a brief moment, their eyes met. And in that silent exchange, there was no accusation, no triumph, only a calm certainty that required no words. And it was that, more than anything, that unsettled him, because he realized that she had never needed to prove anything to him or to anyone else in that room. The proof had always existed, waiting only for the moment it could no longer be ignored. And as the applause continued, some calling out, some rising to their feet with renewed energy, Eleanor simply reached the side of the stage and stopped, her hands folding gently in front of her once more, returning to the same quiet composure she had carried before. And yet nothing about her felt the same anymore, not to them, not to anyone who had witnessed what had just taken place. And in the back rows, students who had once whispered now stood in stunned respect, their earlier laughter replaced by something far heavier, something that would linger long after this night ended. And Maestro Graves finally moved, taking a single step forward as if to reclaim the stage, but he stopped before reaching it, the weight of the moment holding him back, because for the first time in a long time, he understood that some moments do not belong to those who try to control them, they belong to those who reveal them. And as the applause slowly began to soften, not because the admiration had faded, but because the room itself seemed to understand that the moment had reached its natural end, a quiet truth settled over the conservatory, one that did not need to be spoken aloud, that brilliance does not always arrive with recognition, and dignity does not demand attention. But when the two meet, even the most certain voices are left with nothing to say. And that night, in a hall built to celebrate greatness, it was not the loudest name that defined the moment, but the quietest presence that changed it forever. The applause did not end quickly. It lingered, rising and falling in waves that seemed unwilling to let go of what had just unfolded. And yet Eleanor Hayes did not step forward to receive it. She did not bow again or seek the center of the stage. Instead, she remained near the side, her presence calm and composed, as though she had already moved beyond the moment, while everyone else was still trying to understand it. And one by one, the audience began to settle, the standing ovation easing into a quieter respect, conversations starting to form in hushed tones, fragments of disbelief and admiration weaving through the hall like echoes of the performance itself. And near the front, Isabel Crown finally lowered her hands, her expression thoughtful, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet introspection that she could not easily explain, because what she had witnessed had shifted something fundamental, not just about Eleanor, but about the assumptions she had carried without question. And across the room, faculty members exchanged glances that spoke more than words, their polished certainty disrupted by a reality they had not anticipated. And Maestro Leonard Graves, still standing where he had been, took a slow breath, the weight of the moment pressing against him in a way he could not ignore, because this was no longer about a single performance. It was about what that performance revealed. And for a man who had built his reputation on judgment, on the ability to recognize talent with precision, the realization that he had overlooked something so profound was not just unsettling, it was deeply personal. And as the room continued to settle, he finally stepped forward, his movement drawing attention once more, though this time the energy was different, quieter, more expectant, and he approached the piano slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward Eleanor, who met it without hesitation, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. and for a moment, it seemed as though he might speak, might attempt to reclaim control of the narrative, but no words came, because there were none that could reshape what had already been seen and heard, and instead, he turned slightly toward the audience, offering a measured nod, an acknowledgement that carried a weight far greater than any formal introduction or explanation. And then he stepped back, yielding the space without announcement, without resistance, because in that moment, the stage no longer belonged to him, and perhaps it never truly had. And Eleanor, seeing this, did not step forward either. She simply inclined her head once more, a small gesture that felt complete in itself, before turning away from the piano and beginning to walk toward the exit at the side of the hall, her steps quiet against the polished floor, each one carrying her further from the center of attention she had never sought. And yet as she moved, something remarkable happened. The room parted, not physically, but in attention, every eye following her path, every conversation pausing as if to hold onto the presence that had just altered the atmosphere so completely, and no one called out, no one attempted to stop her, because there was an unspoken understanding that this moment did not need to be prolonged. It had already fulfilled its purpose, and as she reached the doorway, the light from the corridor beyond casting a softer glow around her, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not to look back, but as if to acknowledge the transition from one space to another, from one role to another, and then she stepped through, disappearing from view as quietly as she had arrived, leaving behind a room that would not return to what it had been before. And long after she was gone, the conservatory remained still, not out of emptiness, but out of reflection, because sometimes the most powerful change does not come with noise or confrontation. It arrives quietly, reshaping everything without asking permission. And that night, every person in that hall carried something with them as they eventually rose and made their way out, something unspoken yet undeniable. The understanding that true brilliance does not announce itself, and dignity, once revealed, does not need to stay to be remembered. The corridor outside the recital hall felt quieter than it should have, as if the sound from inside had refused to follow Eleanor Hayes beyond the threshold. And for a few seconds after she stepped through the door, she simply walked, her pace steady, her hands loosely folded in front of her, the soft hum of distant conversations fading behind her with each step, until all that remained was the faint echo of her own movement against the polished floor. And yet even here, away from the stage, away from the eyes that had finally seen her, there was no urgency in her actions, no sign that she had just altered the atmosphere of an entire conservatory, because for Eleanor, the moment had already settled into something complete, something finished, and she carried it with the same quiet composure she had carried everything else in her life, without display, without need for acknowledgement. And as she reached a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs of past performers, faces frozen in moments of applause and recognition, she slowed slightly, her gaze drifting across them, not with longing, not with regret, but with a calm familiarity, as if she recognized something in those images that others might not. And for a brief moment, her reflection appeared faintly in the glass beside one of the frames, overlapping with the image of a younger pianist captured mid-performance. And though no one else was there to see it, the contrast told a story that had never been spoken aloud. A story of distance not measured in miles or years, but in choices, in silence, in the quiet reshaping of a life that had once followed a very different path. And somewhere behind her, the door to the recital hall opened again, the sound subtle but distinct, followed by footsteps that were quicker, less measured, carrying a sense of urgency that did not belong to Eleanor. And she did not turn immediately. She did not react as though she expected to be followed, because in truth, she had not been waiting for anything. And yet the footsteps drew closer, slowing as they approached, until a voice finally broke the quiet, tentative at first, then clearer, calling her name with a tone that held both disbelief and a need for confirmation. And Eleanor paused, her hand resting lightly against the edge of a nearby table, before turning just enough to acknowledge the presence behind her. And there stood Isabel Crown, her usual poise softened by something more genuine, something unguarded, her breath slightly uneven from having hurried, her eyes searching Eleanor's face not for validation, but for understanding. as if she needed to reconcile the person she thought she knew with the one she had just witnessed, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them different from the one inside the hall, less heavy, more uncertain, as though it was waiting to be shaped rather than preserved, and Isabel took a small step forward, her voice quieter now, almost careful, as she finally asked the question that had been forming since the first note had filled the room. Not how Eleanor had played, not how she had learned, but simply who she was. And the question hung there, stripped of judgment, stripped of assumption, and Eleanor regarded her calmly, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady in a way that suggested she had heard variations of that question before, in different places, at different times, and yet she did not answer immediately, not because she was hesitant, but because the answer, whatever form it took, did not feel urgent, did not feel necessary in the way Isabel might have expected. And instead, she offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, not dismissive, not evasive, but grounded, as if to say that some things do not need to be explained in words, because they have already been understood in a far more lasting way. And then, after a brief pause, she spoke, her voice soft but clear, carrying none of the weight the room had placed on her, only a quiet certainty, and whatever she said in that moment was not meant to redefine her in Isabel's eyes, but to remind her of something far simpler, something that had been present all along, and as the words settled between them, the tension eased, replaced by a quiet acceptance that did not require further questioning, and Isabel nodded slowly, not fully comprehending, but no longer needing to, because the answer she had been searching for was not in the details, but in the realization that she had overlooked something essential, something that could not be measured by titles or appearances. And as Eleanor turned once more to continue down the corridor, her steps just as steady as before, Isabel remained where she was, watching her go, not with confusion now, but with a kind of respect that had not existed earlier that evening. And in that quiet hallway, away from the applause and the stage, the shift that had begun inside the conservatory continued, subtle but lasting, reshaping not just how one woman was seen, but how another began to see the world around her. The hallway grew quieter as Eleanor Hayes continued walking, her footsteps steady, unhurried, as though the world behind her had already faded into something distant and complete. And yet the impact of what had happened inside the conservatory had not remained contained within those walls. It began to ripple outward, carried in hushed conversations, in widened eyes, in the subtle shift of tone as students and faculty alike tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. And back inside the grand hall, the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be reversed. The polished certainty that once defined the space now replaced by something far more uncertain, far more human. And Maestro Leonard Graves stood near the piano, his hand resting lightly against its edge, not as a gesture of ownership, but almost as if he needed to steady himself against the weight of realization. His gaze lowered, his thoughts no longer aligned with the confidence he had carried just moments before. Because the performance had not simply impressed the room, it had exposed something deeper, something he had not anticipated, the limits of his own judgment. And as the audience slowly began to disperse, conversations filled the air, not loud, not chaotic, but thoughtful, measured, filled with a kind of respect that had not been present earlier that evening. And Isabel Crown eventually returned to the hall, her expression composed but changed, her steps slower, more deliberate, as she glanced once more toward the piano, now empty, its silence echoing louder than any applause had. And she paused near the front row, her hand brushing lightly against the back of a chair, as if grounding herself in the reality of the moment, because something within her had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a quiet, lasting way that would influence how she saw every performance from this point forward. And across the room, a group of students who had once whispered now spoke in subdued tones, their earlier assumptions replaced by a shared understanding that talent did not always announce itself in the ways they had been taught to recognize. And one of them, still holding a program booklet, folded it carefully, as though the evening had become something worth remembering rather than dismissing. And near the stage, Maestro Graves finally straightened, drawing a slow breath as he looked out over the nearly empty hall. The grandeur of the space, unchanged, yet undeniably altered in meaning. And for a brief moment, he closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, because there are moments that cannot be undone, only understood. And when he opened them again, his expression had shifted, not back to what it was before, but into something quieter, more reflective, as though the certainty he once relied on had been replaced by a question he would carry forward. And outside, beyond the walls of the conservatory, the night air felt still, cool against the fading warmth of the evening, and Eleanor Hayes stepped into it without hesitation, the city lights stretching out before her in soft reflections, cars passing at a distance, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing unchanged, and she walked along the sidewalk with the same calm presence she had carried throughout the night, not looking back, not pausing to consider what had been left behind, because for her, the moment had not been about recognition or validation. It had been about something far simpler, something she had always understood, that what is true does not need to be proven repeatedly. It only needs to be expressed when the moment calls for it. And as she moved further down the street, her figure gradually blending into the quiet patterns of the night, the significance of what had occurred remained, not in her actions, but in the way it had reshaped the perception of those who had witnessed it. And back inside the conservatory, long after the last guest had left and the lights had begun to dim, the piano remained where it was, silent and still, yet somehow different, as though it too had been part of something that could not be fully explained. And in that silence, the truth of the evening lingered, not as a memory that would fade, but as a quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments are not the ones that demand attention, but the ones that change it, leaving behind a shift that continues long after the sound has disappeared. By the following morning, the conservatory did not look any different. The same marble floors reflecting the early light, the same grand piano resting in quiet stillness at the center of the hall, the same walls lined with portraits of celebrated performers. And yet for those who had been there the night before, nothing about it felt the same, because the memory of what had happened lingered not as a spectacle, but as a quiet disruption of everything they thought they understood. And conversations began again, this time more deliberate, more thoughtful, faculty members speaking in measured tones about interpretation and presence, students questioning assumptions they had once accepted without hesitation. And even the way the piano was approached seemed to carry a new awareness, as though it was no longer just an instrument to be mastered, but something that demanded respect beyond skill alone. And Isabel Crown stood near the back of the hall. That morning, watching as another student practiced, her posture attentive, her expression calm but changed, because she was no longer listening for perfection. She was listening for something deeper, something she had not known to value before. And across the room, Maestro Leonard Graves entered quietly, his presence still commanding attention, yet different in a way that could not be easily defined. And as he walked toward the piano, there was no trace of the calculated confidence he had carried the night before. Instead, there was a subtle restraint in his movements, a quiet recognition that something within him had shifted. And when he reached the instrument, he paused, his hand resting lightly on its surface, not as a claim, but as an acknowledgement, as though he understood that the stage it occupied was not his to control, only to share. And for a moment, he simply stood there, the memory of Eleanor Hayes's performance playing back in his mind not as a challenge, but as a lesson he could not ignore. And though he did not speak of it openly, the change in his demeanor carried its own message, one that did not need explanation, because those who had witnessed the night before already understood. And outside the conservatory, the city moved forward without pause, cars passing, people walking, life continuing in its ordinary rhythm. And somewhere along a quiet street, Eleanor Hayes walked once more, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, as if the extraordinary moment she had created existed only as a brief intersection in a life defined by something far quieter. And she carried no sign of what she had done, no visible trace of the impact she had left behind, because for her, it had never been about altering how others saw her. It had been about remaining true to something within herself that did not require recognition to exist. And as the day unfolded, the story of the performance began to spread, not loudly, not exaggerated, but in the way meaningful things often do, through quiet retelling, through moments of reflection, through the subtle shift in how people spoke and listened, and though many would attempt to define what had happened, to place it within the boundaries of explanation, it would never fully fit, because what Eleanor had revealed was not just talent. It was something more enduring, something that could not be measured or replicated. And back in the conservatory, as the morning light continued to fill the hall, a single truth settled into the space, not announced, not written, but understood by those willing to see it. That greatness does not always stand at the center of the room. Sometimes it waits quietly at the edge, unnoticed until the moment it chooses to be seen. And when it finally steps forward, it does not ask for permission. It simply exists, undeniable and complete, leaving behind a silence that speaks louder than anything that came before. And on that day, in a place built to celebrate excellence, the lesson that remained was not about performance, but about perception, about the quiet cost of underestimation, and about the kind of dignity that does not need to prove itself, because it has always been there, waiting, patient and certain, for the moment the world is ready to recognize what it once overlooked.